I am not a man given to confession. Ask anyone in the 3 counties surrounding Caldenmere Hall and they will tell you the same. The Duke of Caldenmere speaks when he must, moves when it serves him, and keeps every soft thing locked behind walls thick as the ones that have stood around this estate for 200 years. They call me cold. They call me unreachable. After Catherine died and left me with nothing but the title and the silence, I did not argue with them. Let them think what they liked. The cold has its uses. It keeps the world at a bearable distance. But I am going to tell you something I have never told another living soul. For 2 years I watched her. Not in any manner that shames me, I want to say that plainly. There was nothing predatory in it, nothing calculated. The first time I saw Miss Alara Voss, I had not even meant to look. I had ridden out early along the south edge of the estate, the part of the grounds my steward calls the lower lane, where the old foundling cottage sits just inside the property wall, tucked behind a stand of copper beech trees. My father built that cottage in some fit of conscience 40 years ago. After he died, it passed like everything else to me, and I kept it funded the way I kept the stables and the ice house funded, as a matter of order. You maintain what is yours, that is all. It was October, the mist was still on the grass. I had ridden out before breakfast to clear my head of the London business that always followed me home like smoke, a disputed claim on a mill, a letter from my man of affairs requiring a decision, the usual weight of consequence. I came around the line of beeches without particular intention, and I stopped. She was sitting on the low stone step outside the cottage door. There was a child in her lap, one of the littler ones I would learn later, a girl of perhaps 4 years, just arrived the week before and still too frightened to go inside willingly at night. The woman, she was perhaps 22, plainly dressed, her dark hair pinned up with the simplicity of someone who has never had time to arrange it more cleverly, was talking to the child. Not in the high, bright voice people use to manage small children, the way they handle a difficult piece of furniture. She was simply talking, quietly, steadily, as though the child's fear were entirely reasonable and she had all the morning in the world to sit with it. The child said something. The woman laughed, not a polite laugh, but a real one, the kind that comes from somewhere genuine, and pressed her cheek, briefly, against the top of the child's head. I sat on my horse for perhaps 30 seconds before I realized I had stopped. Then I turned and rode back the way I had come. I did not ask about her that day. I had a rule about that sort of thing, since Catherine, you do not pull at threads you are not prepared to follow. But my memory is not so obliging as my discipline, and the image stayed with me through the mill dispute and the letter and the rest of that gray October day. Her voice, steady against the silence. The child's small hands folded in her lap like a sleeping bird, the laugh that she had not arranged for anyone's benefit. I rode south again 3 days later. I told myself it was because the ice was forming early on the lower pond, and I wanted to see to the drain before it backed up under the wall. This was true, incidentally. I did check the drain, but I also stopped at the edge of the copper beeches and looked toward the cottage door. She was there again. Different child this time, one of the older boys, 7 or 8, who had been giving the matron trouble all week, I gathered, from the way she was sitting beside him on the wall with her sketchbook open between them. She was drawing something. He was watching, then leaning in, then evidently making some criticism that made her tilt her head and add a line. Whatever she drew made him laugh and point. She let him take the pencil. I checked the drain, I rode home. You understand what was happening, even if I did not permit myself to understand it at the time. I was manufacturing reasons to go to the south end of the estate. The drainage work was real, and then it was finished, and then I found other reasons. A fence post that needed inspecting, a question for my gamekeeper, an interest in the copper beeches that I had never previously felt. My groom, Tully, said nothing, because Tully has been with me long enough to know when silence is required of him. But I noticed him not looking at me in the particular way men do when they are actively choosing not to notice something. I found out her name from the cottage matron, Mrs. Frome, in what I intended to be a casual inquiry during one of my quarterly reviews of the household accounts. I asked who the young woman was, the dark-haired one who came on Tuesdays and Fridays. Mrs. Frome looked at me with an expression I did not quite know how to read and said her name was Miss Alara Voss, niece of the Reverend Voss who held the living at Caldenmere Parish. She had been coming to the cottage for almost 3 years before me, that was. She had begun when the old Duke still held the estate and no one had thought to formalize the arrangement, so she simply continued. No wage, no particular acknowledgement. She came because she came. Mrs. Frome paused, then added carefully, "She is very good with the children, Your Grace." I said that was satisfactory, and turned back to the accounts. What I did not say, what I kept absolutely to myself, as I reviewed the quarterly figures in Mrs. Frome's small sitting room, was that I had already been watching for 6 months by then, and could have described Miss Alara Voss in the kind of detail that would have surprised the woman herself. The particular way she held her head when she was listening to a child who was upset, tipping it slightly to the left as though ensuring she missed nothing. The cloth bag she brought on Fridays, larger on the first Friday of each month, which I eventually understood was because she refilled it after the Sunday collection at the vicarage, supplemented with whatever she had purchased out of her own small income. The fact that she always checked, before she left, that the youngest children had eaten something. The fact that she walked home in all weather without apparent objection. I was, to put it plainly, paying close attention, and I was saying nothing to anyone about it, which is the behavior of a man who knows he is behaving strangely and has decided not to submit it to examination. Mrs. Frome paused, then added carefully, "She is very good with the children, Your Grace." I said that was satisfactory, and turned back to the accounts. She was very good with the children, that was the thing. I had watched enough from my position at the edge of the beaches on horseback, at what I told myself was a perfectly respectable and incidental distance, to understand what I was observing. There are people who are kind to the unfortunate in the way that one is kind to a stray, with a certain performing benevolence, a consciousness of the virtue being accumulated. Miss Voss was not that. She brought things with her in a cloth bag, paper, pencils, bits of ribbon, once what appeared to be a set of small painted wooden animals, and she distributed them with the casual abundance of someone who has thought carefully beforehand and doesn't want anyone to notice. She remembered names. She remembered which child was frightened of the dark, and which one was frightened of loud sounds, and which one had a birthday in February. She sat on cold stone steps and damp grass without apparent concern for her dress. She left every Friday afternoon and walked the mile back to the vicarage, and I would watch her go until the copper beeches closed behind her, and then I would ride home. I was, to use a word I find approximately as comfortable as a stone in my boot, smitten. I was also, I want to be clear, entirely useless about it. I had not spoken to the woman in 2 years of watching, not once. I had no particular excuse. I was a duke. I was the proprietor of the estate on which that cottage stood. I could have introduced myself to the entirety of the parish any Tuesday morning simply by arriving and saying my name. But I did not. Something had calcified in me since Catherine, something that I recognized even then as unreasonable. A conviction that whatever tenderness I felt was mine to keep behind glass, to observe and never touch, because anything I reached for had a tendency to go wrong in my hands. Catherine had loved me, and I had not been there when she needed me, and she had died of a fever that came on fast while I was in London managing the very mill that now turned profit enough to fund this cottage and 30 others like it. So I kept my distance. I watched, and I kept my distance, and I told myself this was sufficient. It was not. The matter came to a head on a Thursday in March, which is a day I have replayed so many times in my memory that it has acquired the sharpness of an engraving. I had received a letter that morning from my solicitor in London, forwarded from the county magistrate's office, regarding the Foundling cottage. There was a proposal on the table brought by a consortium of county landowners to consolidate several small charitable establishments into a single large county institution. The language was efficient. The argument was practical. The cottage at Caldenmere, along with 4 others within 20 miles, would be closed. The children transferred to the consolidated house at Whitmore, which was 40 miles distant and large and modern, and almost certainly cold in the way that large modern institutions are cold. The proposal requested my written consent, as proprietor, within a fortnight. I read it twice, I set it aside. I picked it up and read it a 3rd time. I was on my horse before 9 o'clock that morning, riding south. Not a Tuesday or a Friday. A Thursday, her day off from the cottage, I had long since established. Which means that what I was going to do was nothing more complicated than look at the building and think, which was what I told myself in the space between the stable yard and the copper beeches. She was there. That was the first thing I noted, and the thing that stopped me at the edge of the trees exactly as I had stopped every other time. She was there on a Thursday, kneeling in the frost-hardened earth of the small kitchen garden at the side of the cottage, planting something in the cold. She had not been expected. There was no child beside her. She was alone, in a coat that was not quite warm enough for March and gardening gloves that were gray with soil, pressing bulbs into the ground with quiet deliberateness. I think, if I am honest, and I have been working toward honesty throughout this account, that I would have remained at my habitual distance. I might have noted the tableau, felt what I felt, and ridden home to compose my written consent to the transfer. I was quite ready to be a coward in the gentlest possible way. But the gate in the cottage wall swung open, and a small figure came running out, little Rosa, the 4-year-old who had been on the step in October, the very first child I had watched in Miss Voss's arms. She was not supposed to be outside. She had clearly escaped through the gate while someone's attention was elsewhere, and she ran directly to Miss Voss in the garden and threw both arms around her neck with the full, unguarded trust of a child who knows exactly where safety lives. Miss Voss caught her, both of them nearly toppling into the turned earth, and I heard the laugh, the real one, not the arranged kind, ring out clear in the cold March air. That was when she looked up, over the top of Rosa's head, across the frozen garden directly at me. I had nowhere to go. I was in the open. The copper beeches were behind me and the gate was ahead of me, and I was a grown man on a large horse at the edge of a garden, and there was no version of this in which I was simply passing through. She looked at me for a long moment. Her expression was difficult to read, not frightened, not angry, simply measuring, as though she were determining something. Then she said in a clear, unbothered voice, "You must be the Duke of Caldenmere." I descended from my horse. There was nothing else to do. I said yes, I was, and I apologized for startling her, which was inadequate but was what I had. Rosa had withdrawn to press herself against Miss Voss's side, studying me with the frank and unembarrassed appraisal of very small children. Miss Voss set down her trowel. She did not curtsy, which I noted. Not out of disrespect, I thought there was nothing defiant about it. She simply forgot, the sort of woman whose mind is elsewhere when protocol calls. She said, "Mrs. Frome told me you review the accounts quarterly. She said you were very thorough." I said that I tried to be. She looked at me for another moment and then said quietly, "I heard there may be a change to the cottage." I did not ask how she had heard. Parish networks carry news faster than solicitors. I said that I had received a proposal, yes, and that I was considering it. Something shifted in her face. Not anger, she did not permit herself anger, I would learn. Something more precise, a gathering of resolution, a quiet steeling. She said, "The children here are settled, Your Grace. Several of them have been here for more than a year. Rosa," her hand dropped briefly, instinctively, to the child's curls, "was afraid to go inside when she arrived. She is not afraid now. There are 7 children in this cottage who have learned what it feels like to be in the same place 2 weeks in a row. I understand the practical argument for consolidation, but I wonder if the practical argument accounts for what is lost in the moving." She said all of this looking directly at me, with the steadiness I had observed from a distance for 2 years, now turned entirely upon me. It was not an easy thing to receive. I said, "How long have you been coming here, Miss Voss?" She said she had begun 3 years ago, when one of the children had been brought to the vicarage door in a state that required more attention than the matron could manage alone. I said, "And before that, did you know this cottage existed?" She said she had not. "But you've come," I said, "without wage, without formal arrangement for 3 years." She looked at me as though this were not a remarkable thing, as though it were simply the natural consequence of having noticed a need and living close enough to meet it. "Someone had to," she said. I stood in the frozen garden on a Thursday morning in March, with Rosa studying my boots and Miss Alara Voss's steady gray eyes on my face, and I felt the 2 years of accumulated distance collapse in the space of about 30 seconds. I said, "I am not going to consent to the transfer." She blinked. That was the only visible sign that I had surprised her. Then she said simply, "Thank you." I said it was not a difficult decision. This was, frankly, a lie. Or rather, it had been a difficult decision until approximately 3 minutes ago, and had become quite easy since. Rosa pulled at Miss Voss's coat hem and said something in the low, urgent way of children who have an agenda. Miss Voss glanced down at her, and the smile that crossed her face was the one I knew from the beaches, unguarded, full, entirely unconscious of any audience. I said before I could reason myself out of it. Miss Voss. She looked up. I said, I have been riding along the south edge of this estate for 2 years, on various pretexts. There was a silence. The frost cracked somewhere in the garden. Rosa appeared to have lost interest in the conversation and was investigating a gap in the wall. Miss Voss said carefully, I see. I said, Mrs. Frome told me your name 14 months ago. I have not forgotten it a single day since. Another silence, longer this time. She said, I think you should probably have introduced yourself, Your Grace. Yes, I said, I should have. I was unable to. She looked at me with the measuring expression again. Why? This was, I thought, a rather direct question for a woman who had just met me. But then, I had been watching her sit on cold stone steps for 2 years, and she had been unaware of any of it, which meant she had not had time to construct the social scaffolding that most people erect before saying a thing like that. I said, because I was not sure what I would do with it afterward, if I spoke to you. I was not sure I was ready for what came next. She absorbed this. Rosa had now extracted herself from the garden entirely and was making her way back toward the cottage door with purpose. We were alone in the kitchen garden with the frost and the turned earth and the bulbs she had been pressing into the ground. She said, and now? I said, now I find I am more afraid of the alternative. She looked at me for a long moment. There was something in her face that I could not quite name, not softness exactly, because she was not a soft woman in the ordinary sense. Something warmer than measurement, something that was choosing. She said, I have been walking past Caldenmere Hall on my way home from the cottage every Friday afternoon for 3 years, Your Grace. And I have looked up at the windows sometimes, wondering what sort of man was in there. I said, and what did you conclude? She said, I thought you must be very lonely. The lights are never on in the evening rooms. I had nothing to say to that, because it was precisely true, and she had seen it from the lane in a way I had never seen it myself. She picked up her trowel. She set it in the basket at her feet. She pulled off one gardening glove and then the other, and she looked at me and she said, I believe Mrs. Frome has tea on at 9:30 if you were inclined to come in, Your Grace. I tied my horse at the gate. I came in. That was the beginning of it. The actual beginning. That is, the hours and the Tuesday mornings and the Friday afternoons that came after. The letters that passed between Caldenmere Hall and the vicarage in the weeks that followed. The slow and entirely irreversible process by which a man who had kept himself behind glass for 4 years finds that the glass has come down. It did not happen all at once. We sat in Mrs. Frome's kitchen on that Thursday morning while Rosa and 2 other children climbed on and around the furniture, and Miss Voss drank her tea and asked me questions about the estate accounts with the directness of someone who has decided that pretense is not worth the time. Not impertinent questions. She was not impertinent. She was simply precise. She wanted to know what the quarterly budget for the cottage actually allowed, because she had 3 requests to bring before me that she had been drafting in her head for. I gathered, some time and now that I was actually present, she had no intention of wasting the opportunity. I answered her honestly, which is not something I am accustomed to doing with anyone. The first request was for a proper window in the dormitory room on the north side, which was dark and cold, and no amount of candlelight fully corrected. The second was for a small library of books. She had a list, written in a hand that was small and extremely neat, which she produced from her coat pocket with the casualness of someone who always carries important papers about their person. The third was more complicated. She said there was a boy, Thomas, aged 9, who was clever in a way that the cottage schooling could not accommodate, and she had been wondering whether the grammar school at the county town might consider him if someone of standing were to write in support. She looked at me when she said it. I understood that the someone of standing was me. I told her that I would write the letter that afternoon. Something in her expression changed, very slightly, almost imperceptibly, the way light changes on water. She said thank you, and she meant it entirely, and she returned to her tea, and I sat across from her in Mrs. Frome's kitchen with Rosa on the bench beside me offering me a small painted wooden horse she had apparently adopted as her own, and I thought, this is the most at home I have felt in 4 years. I attended the cottage on more Tuesdays and Fridays after that. Not everyone. I had an estate to manage, and she had her own rhythm, but enough that Mrs. Frome stopped looking surprised when my horse appeared at the gate. I wrote the letter for Thomas, who was admitted to the grammar school in April and thrived there, which is a piece of information that still produces something warm in my chest when I recall it. I funded the window and the library. Ilara, she permitted me the use of her Christian name on the 1st of April, with an air of someone making a minor administrative concession, expanded the list of books considerably once she understood that I was not going to argue about the budget. She asked at one point why I had funded the cottage so steadily when I had never once come to see it. I said my father funded it. I simply continued. She said that is not quite an answer. I said no, I suppose it is not. I set down my cup. I think I knew at some level that there was something in it I was not prepared to look at directly, something that felt too close to what I had. I stopped, started again. My wife died 4 years ago. She was very kind to people she did not know. I maintained what she would have maintained. I thought that was sufficient. Miss Voss was quiet for a moment. Then she said very gently, "It was sufficient, and it is more than that now." She meant the children, of course. She meant Rosa and the boy with the sketchbook and the 7 others who would not be moved to Whitmore. But she was also, I understood, talking about something else, about what it is to do a good thing from behind glass and what it is to step through. I proposed at the end of April, in the most undramatic fashion imaginable. We were in the cottage library, the new one just installed, the shelves still smelling of fresh wood, and she was organizing the books in what appeared to be a system of her own devising, while I read through the accounts she had left for me on the table. It occurred to me, as I looked up from the ledger and watched her place a volume carefully on the middle shelf with the concentration of someone doing something that mattered to her, that I did not want this to be an occasional thing. That I had spent 2 years watching from a distance and the last month and a half in proximity, and that proximity had ruined me for distance in a way that was complete and permanent. I said, "Ilara." She turned, a book still in her hands. I said, "I am going to ask you something, and I want you to take the time you need before answering, because it is an entirely serious question, and I have been working up to it for rather longer than is probably reasonable." She set the book down. She looked at me with the gray eyes that I had known from 40 yards for 2 years and now knew from across a table, and she said, "Yes." I said, "I haven't asked it yet." She said, "I know, but yes." I looked at her for a moment, then I said, "You could at least let me say it properly." She sat down in the chair across from me, folded her hands in her lap, and gave me her full attention with an expression of patient forbearance. I said what I had been composing for 3 weeks. She listened to all of it without interrupting, which was generous because it went on somewhat. When I finished, she said yes again in exactly the same tone, and the word contained everything. We were married in May. I will not pretend that society received the news without comment. The Duke of Caldenmere, feared and cold and unapproachable for 4 years, was to marry the penniless niece of the vicar of a parish most people in the county could not have found on a map. There were letters. There were several conversations in drawing rooms that I was told about afterward. There were a great many people with opinions about what a duke of my standing was owed and a wife. Connections, fortune, breeding, at minimum a name that appeared in the relevant books. I did not answer the letters. I did not attend the drawing room conversations. I had spent 2 years watching a woman press her cheek against the head of a frightened 4-year-old on a cold October morning, and I was not especially interested in what the county had to say about it. Ilara received the news of society's displeasure with the equanimity she received most things. She told me once in that direct way she had that she had never in her life expected society to approve of anything she did, so its disapproval was not particularly frightening. I asked her why not. She said, "Because I spent my 20s doing things that mattered to me, and none of them involved a ballroom." She had a point. She was, in almost every way that the world of 1847 measured a woman's value, unremarkable. No fortune, no connection, no particular beauty by the conventions that counted beauty then. What she had was the thing I had watched for 2 years from the far side of a copper beach. An uncalculated, unperforming, entirely genuine goodness that she distributed as freely as sunlight, and never once asked to be thanked for. I had been frightened of her, I think, not of her personally, but of what she represented. A person who is capable of that kind of goodness holds up a mirror, and I had not liked what I saw in mine for a long time. Rosa came to us the following autumn, when it became clear that no family had come forward, and the cottage was, for her, home. We did not make a ceremony of it. Ilara simply came home one Friday with Rosa on her hand and a small cloth bag, and the matter was settled in the way that Ilara settled most things. Quietly, without fuss, as though it had always been the arrangement, and everyone had simply failed to write it down. I sat with Rosa in the library on her first evening at Caldenmere Hall, while Ilara was talking to Mrs. Frome in the kitchen, and I read her 3 chapters of a book about a very small bear who lived in a very large forest and managed everything eventually. Rosa fell asleep against my arm before the end of the 3rd chapter, and I sat very still so as not to wake her, and I thought about the man I had been on that October morning 2 years before, sitting on his horse at the edge of the copper beeches, watching a woman he had not yet spoken to, convinced that distance was the same thing as safety. It is not, I know that now. Distance is simply absence arranged to look like prudence. When Ilara came to find us and saw Rosa asleep and me not moving, she stopped in the library doorway and she looked at me with an expression I have never been able to describe precisely, only to say that it was the expression of someone watching a thing become real that they had quietly hoped for without quite believing in. She leaned against the doorframe. She did not say anything. She did not need to. We have been married 7 years now. The cottage at Caldenmere is still open. We have added a second building to the south of it, with a proper schoolroom and a larger kitchen, and Mrs. Frome is long since retired and is replaced by a young woman of competence whom Ilara found and trained. 3 more children have come to us from the cottage over the years, in the quiet, settled way that Rosa came, not in drama, not in ceremony, but in the gradual logic of need finding the right address. Caldenmere Hall is a different place than it was. The evening rooms have lights in them now. I think sometimes about that March morning in the kitchen garden. About the 30 seconds in which I watched Rosa throw her arms around Ilara's neck, and the laugh that rang out across the frost, and the 2 years of watched mornings that had arrived, finally, at a door I was able to open. I could have opened it sooner, I know that. I was not ready, and then I was. What I know and what I want to record somewhere in case it is useful to someone, though I am not, as I said, a man given to confession, is this. There are women in this world whom no one is watching, whom society has decided are not worth the watching. And there are men like me who have stood at a distance and told themselves that observation is the same as reverence, and that reverence is enough. It is not enough. You go through the gate. You sit in the kitchen with the cold tea and the children on the furniture and the trowel still caked with garden earth, and you tell the truth, and you find out whether the 2 years of distance have left you anywhere worth being. She looked up from the garden and saw me, finally, standing where I had always been, and she brought me in from the cold. That was all, that was everything,